"Ma'am, you need to get out of that seat. Now!" Rachel Coleman's voice sliced through the cabin like a blade dipped in ice water. Sharp. Final. Designed to humiliate. She towered over the black woman in seat 14C, her blonde hair pulled so tight it seemed to fuel the permanent scowl etched across her face. 22 years of airline service had twisted into pure, unfiltered authority, and today that authority had found its target. The woman in 14C looked up slowly, her brown eyes meeting Rachel's cold blue stare. She was dressed simply in a worn denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, cheap reading glasses perched on her nose, clutching a paperback romance novel. Everything about her screamed ordinary. Everything about her whispered that she didn't belong in first class. What Rachel Coleman didn't know was that in exactly 38 minutes, the woman she was targeting would ground her entire airline and end her career forever. Before we dive into this shocking story that changed aviation history, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe that respect should be standard at 30,000 feet, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one. Now let's rewind to how this moment started. Dr. Jasmine Brooks had walked onto Skystream Airlines Flight 447, carrying more than just a boarding pass. She carried 20 years of aviation expertise, a PhD in aviation safety management, and the federal authority to shut down any airline that failed to meet basic human decency standards. But today, she wasn't Dr. Jasmine Brooks, Senior Inspector with the FAA's National Covert Auditing Division. Today, she was Monica Davis, a nervous librarian from Atlanta flying to Denver to visit her sick aunt. The transformation was perfect. Gone was the confident posture that commanded boardrooms. Gone was the sharp business attire that announced expertise. In its place was uncertainty, hesitation, and the kind of humble presentation that certain people loved to dismiss. Jasmine had perfected this disguise over dozens of covert operations. The slightly oversized glasses that made her look studious but harmless. The worn jacket that suggested modest means. The way she fumbled with her boarding pass just enough to appear inexperienced. Every detail calculated to reveal the true character of those who held power over passengers. Skystream Airlines had been on the FAA's radar for months. Complaints flooded in weekly. Passengers reported discrimination, hostile crew behavior, and a corporate culture that seemed to encourage prejudice rather than prevent it. The CEO, Brandon Mitchell, had built his budget airline empire by cutting costs everywhere, including diversity training, proper oversight, and basic human decency protocols. When complaints reached federal intervention levels, they sent Jasmine. She didn't just check safety equipment and maintenance logs. She exposed the human failures that turned planes into theaters of humiliation. Rachel Coleman stood in the galley reviewing her passenger manifest with the kind of suspicious scrutiny usually reserved for criminal investigations. 22 years in the sky had hardened her into something resembling customer service, but functioning as customer control. Her eyes scanned the first-class section lingering on seat 14C. Monica Davis. Paid with a credit card. No frequent flyer status. No corporate booking. Just a woman who somehow managed to afford first class despite looking like she shopped at thrift stores. Rachel's jaw tightened. She'd seen this before, or at least she told herself she had. People who didn't belong trying to sneak into spaces reserved for real travelers. Her job, as she understood it, was to maintain standards, to keep the riffraff in economy where they belonged. She grabbed her tablet and marched down the aisle, her sensible shoes clicking against the cabin floor with military precision. Other passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, sensing the tension building like static electricity before a storm. Tommy Martinez, a 28-year-old travel blogger with 50,000 Instagram followers, was settled into seat 12A when he noticed Rachel's approach. Something about her body language triggered his journalist instincts. He quietly opened his phone's camera app and began recording. Rachel stopped at row 14, her shadow falling across Jasmine like a threat. "Excuse me," she said, though her tone suggested no politeness was actually intended. "I need to see your boarding pass." Jasmine looked up from her book, pushing her glasses up her nose with a nervous gesture that was entirely manufactured. "Oh, of course," she said, her voice soft and uncertain. She fumbled in her purse, pulling out the boarding pass with slightly shaking hands. Rachel snatched it, studying every detail as if it were evidence in a crime. "This says first class," she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied quietly. "I saved up for months for this trip." "Saved up," Rachel repeated the words, dripping with disbelief. She looked Jasmine up and down again, taking in the worn jacket, the simple jewelry, the complete absence of the designer accessories she associated with legitimate first-class passengers. Tommy's phone captured everything. Rachel's obvious suspicion, Jasmine's careful politeness, the uncomfortable stares from other passengers. He could already feel this had the potential to go viral. "This seat costs $200. Rachel continued, her voice growing louder. "You're telling me you saved up $1,200 for a 2-hour flight?" Jasmine nodded, maintaining her nervous librarian persona perfectly. "My aunt is very sick. I wanted to be comfortable for the flight since I'm scared of flying." "Scared of flying?" Rachel scoffed. "Then why didn't you choose a direct flight instead of paying extra for first class?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, other passengers began to pay attention. A white businessman in 13D lowered his newspaper. A Hispanic family across the aisle turned to watch. The cabin was transforming from a collection of individual travelers into an audience for whatever was about to unfold. Jasmine felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being interrogated for existing. But she also felt something else: professional satisfaction. In less than 5 minutes, Rachel Coleman had revealed exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that the FAA was investigating. I just wanted to be comfortable," Jasmine stammered. Playing her role perfectly, Rachel held up the boarding pass, examining it against the light as if checking for counterfeits. "This looks suspicious to me," she announced. "Boarding passes can be faked. I've seen it before." That's when Tommy Martinez made the decision that would change everything. He switched his phone from photo mode to live streaming and whispered to his camera, "Y'all, I'm witnessing something incredible right now. This flight attendant is literally interrogating a black passenger for sitting in first class. This is happening live on Skystream Flight 447. Within 30 seconds, viewers began joining the stream. Within 2 minutes, the chat was exploding with comments. Rachel's interrogation was just beginning. She handed the boarding pass back to Jasmine with the kind of dismissive gesture reserved for handling garbage. "I'm going to need to see your credit card," Rachel announced. "The one you used to purchase this ticket." Jasmine blinked, her manufactured confusion perfectly authentic looking. "My credit card. Is that standard procedure?" "It is when I suspect fraud," Rachel replied loudly, ensuring every passenger in first class could hear. "We have protocols for suspicious purchases." Tommy's live stream viewership jumped to 200, then 400, then 800 as word spread across social media. Comments flooded in. "This is disgusting. Call her out. Someone needs to stop this. Is this really happening in 2024? But Tommy kept filming, sensing this story was bigger than just one discriminatory flight attendant. Jasmine reached into her purse and pulled out a credit card, a simple bank debit card with her alias name clearly printed, Monica Davis. She handed it to Rachel with trembling fingers that weren't entirely an act. Rachel studied the card like a forensic investigator, comparing the name to the boarding pass, then to Jasmine's driver's license. "This card has a very low limit," she said after checking something on her tablet. "How exactly did you afford a $200 seat with a card that has a $2,000 limit?" The question was designed to humiliate. Rachel was essentially announcing to the entire cabin that this black woman was poor, implying she must have stolen or scammed her way into first class. Jasmine's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained small and nervous. I saved up and paid it off specifically for this trip. Like I said, my aunt is very sick. Your Aunt Rachel repeated with obvious skepticism. What's her name? What's wrong with her? Why are you flying to Denver specifically? The interrogation was escalating beyond any reasonable standard. Around them, passengers began exchanging uncomfortable glances. The white businessman in 13D, Mr. Davidson, initially seemed supportive of Rachel's diligence, nodding approvingly at what he perceived as good security procedures. But as the questions became more invasive, more obviously discriminatory, even his expression began to shift. Tommy's stream viewership hit 1,500. His viewers were furious, demanding action. Someone help this woman. This is racial profiling. Where is the captain record? Everything in the galley. Katie Walsh, a 23-year-old junior flight attendant on her third week of the job, watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She'd been trained to support senior staff, but nothing in her training had prepared her for witnessing obvious discrimination. Katie approached Rachel cautiously. "Rachel," she whispered, "maybe we should just... back to your duties." "Walsh?" Rachel snapped without taking her eyes off Jasmine. "This is a security matter." Rachel turned back to Jasmine, her voice now loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear clearly. "You know what I think? I think you upgraded yourself illegally. I think you're hoping we won't check. I think you're exactly the kind of person who ruins airline travel for legitimate passengers." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped. Others pulled out their phones to record. The Hispanic family across the aisle began speaking rapidly in Spanish, clearly discussing the obvious injustice unfolding before them. Jasmine felt 20 years of professional composure fighting against 20 years of personal experience with exactly this kind of treatment. She remembered being 22, dressed in her best interview suit, being followed around a department store by security. She remembered being 28, pulled over for driving suspiciously in her own neighborhood. She remembered being 35, questioned about whether she really belonged at a medical conference where she was the keynote speaker. But this time was different. This time she had the power to do something about it. "Ma'am," Jasmine said quietly, "I've shown you everything you've asked for. My boarding pass is legitimate. My payment is legitimate. I'm not sure what else I can do to prove I belong here." "Belong here?" Rachel laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Honey, belonging here isn't about what you can prove. It's about what you are." The mask was off. The discrimination was naked, obvious, impossible to deny. Tommy's live stream exploded past 3,000 viewers. Comments were coming so fast he could barely read them. "OMG, this flight attendant is racist AF. Someone call the news. This is going viral. Hashtag Skystream447, justice for this woman." But Rachel wasn't done. She grabbed Jasmine's carry-on bag from the overhead compartment and set it in the aisle. "I need to inspect this as well," she announced. "Security protocols. You can't search her bag," called out a passenger from row 16. "This is harassment." Rachel whipped around her face, flushed with authority and anger. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. I determine what constitutes a security risk. Anyone who interferes will be removed from this flight." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Passengers looked around nervously, wanting to help, but afraid of being ejected from the plane. Jasmine watched Rachel paw through her carefully prepared belongings. The romance novel, anxiety, medication tissues, breath mints, a small notebook for travel memories, and other items designed to support her librarian cover story. Rachel held up the notebook suspiciously. "What's this for?" "I like to write about my travels," Jasmine replied. "For my blog?" "Your blog," Rachel said mockingly. What's it called? How to scam your way into first class. The cruelty was breathtaking. Even Mr. Davidson in 13D was now shaking his head in disapproval. What had started as apparent security diligence had revealed itself as pure ugly prejudice. Katie Walsh couldn't stay silent anymore. Rachel, this isn't right, she said, her young voice carrying clearly through the cabin. She's done nothing wrong. Rachel turned on her junior colleague with venomous authority. Walsh, you are one comment away from being written up. Return to your duties immediately. But Katie didn't move. She looked at Jasmine, then at the passengers, recording everything, then back at Rachel. No, she said quietly but firmly. I won't be part of this. The word no hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Rachel Coleman's face went through a spectrum of emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Surprise at being defied by a junior employee. Rage at the public challenge to her authority. And beneath it all, a flicker of fear that maybe, just maybe, she had gone too far. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel announced, her voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin and into the rows beyond. We have a passenger who has been unable to verify her ticket purchase and who is now causing a disturbance. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, I am implementing additional security protocols. Tommy's live stream was approaching 5,000 viewers. The hashtag SkyStream447 was beginning to trend on Twitter. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of airline discrimination, expressing outrage and demanding justice. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching Rachel dig herself deeper into a federal case that would ultimately destroy her career. Every word, every action, every discriminatory decision was being documented not just by Tommy's live stream, but by Jasmine's trained investigative mind. What security protocols? Asked Mr. Davidson from 13D, his business newspaper folded in his lap. Even he was beginning to understand that what he was witnessing had nothing to do with security and everything to do with prejudice. I am contacting the cockpit to request law enforcement meet this aircraft upon arrival, Rachel announced. This passenger has failed to adequately verify her presence in first class and has become argumentative when asked to comply with standard procedures. Standard procedures, Tommy said loudly, still streaming. Lady, I fly 200,000 miles a year, and I've never seen anyone interrogated like this for sitting in their assigned seat. Rachel whirled toward Tommy, her eyes blazing. Sir, you are interfering with airline operations. I suggest you put away that phone and mind your own business. This is my business, Tommy replied, holding his phone steady. I'm documenting discrimination happening in real time. And so are about 6,000 other people watching live right now. The number hit Rachel like a physical blow. 6,000 people were watching her, recording her, judging her. But instead of recognizing the magnitude of her mistake, Rachel's pride and prejudice drove her forward. Flight attendant to cockpit, she said into her communication device. We have a code yellow in first class, requesting captain's assistance with an uncooperative passenger. Code yellow was airline terminology for a potentially dangerous passenger situation. It was supposed to be reserved for people who were drunk, violent, or threatening. Jasmine had done nothing but sit quietly in her assigned seat and answer invasive questions with polite patience. From the cockpit, Captain Luis Rodriguez heard the call with immediate concern. A 15-year veteran with an impeccable safety record, Rodriguez prided himself on running a professional operation, but he also knew Rachel Coleman's reputation for being thorough with certain passengers. Copy that. Rachel came the captain's voice over the intercom. What's the nature of the disturbance? Passenger in 14C claims to have purchased first-class ticket but cannot adequately verify purchase. Passenger became defensive when asked for additional documentation. Requesting law enforcement meet aircraft upon arrival. Tommy's live stream viewers could hear every word through the cabin speakers. The comments exploded. She's literally lying. The passenger has been completely calm. This flight attendant is making stuff up. Someone needs to call the FAA. This is criminal. Jasmine felt a familiar anger building in her chest, not just at the discrimination, which was routine enough in her experience, but at the blatant lies being told about her behavior. She had been nothing but polite and cooperative, yet was being painted as dangerous and uncooperative. But she also felt something else: professional satisfaction. Rachel Coleman was providing a masterclass in exactly the kind of behavior that the FAA was investigating. Every lie, every discriminatory comment, every policy violation was being captured in real time. Captain Jasmine said, raising her voice enough to be heard throughout the cabin, "I would like to speak with you directly." Rachel spun toward her. "Passengers do not make demands on this aircraft. You will remain silent until we land." "Actually," came a voice from row 15. "Passengers have the right to speak with the captain if they feel they're being treated unfairly." The voice belonged to Maria Santos, an off-duty federal air marshal traveling home to Denver. She wasn't in uniform and hadn't identified herself, but she knew aviation law better than anyone on the plane. "And who exactly are you to interpret airline regulations?" Rachel snapped. Maria smiled grimly. "Someone who enforces them for a living." The tension in the cabin was becoming unbearable. Passengers were openly taking sides, some recording everything, others trying to de-escalate, a few still unsure what they were witnessing. Katie Walsh made a decision that would define her career. She picked up the cabin phone and dialed the cockpit directly. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "this is Katie Walsh. I need to report that I believe we have a discrimination situation in first class. The passenger in 14C has been completely cooperative and has provided all requested documentation. I believe she is being targeted because of her race." The words hung in the air like an explosion. Rachel's face went white, then red, then white again. She had just been publicly accused of racial discrimination by her own crew member in front of a cabin full of passengers while being live-streamed to thousands of people online. "Walsh." Rachel screamed. "You are in direct violation of crew hierarchy. You're fired. You don't have the authority to fire me." Katie replied quietly. "Only the captain does." And in that moment, everyone on Flight 447 understood that they were witnessing something bigger than just bad customer service. They were seeing the moment when authority built on prejudice met courage built on principle. The live stream hit 8,000 viewers. Hashtag racist flight attendant was trending alongside hashtag SkyStream447. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story. And somewhere in a corporate office in Dallas, Skystream Airlines CEO Brandon Mitchell was about to get a phone call that would ruin his day, his week, and possibly his career. Captain Luis Rodriguez unbuckled his harness and stood in the cramped cockpit, his mind racing through protocols and possibilities. In 15 years of flying, he'd dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and even a hijacking attempt. But he'd never faced a situation where his own crew was publicly accusing each other of racial discrimination while being live-streamed to thousands of viewers. "First Officer Chen," he said to his co-pilot, "you have the cockpit. I need to assess the situation in the cabin." Rodriguez was a by-the-book captain who'd earned his position through competence and integrity. He'd grown up in East LA, the son of immigrants who taught him that respect was earned through actions, not demanded through position. He'd seen enough discrimination in his own life to recognize it when it happened to others. But he also knew that Rachel Coleman had been with Skystream for over 2 decades. She had seniority union protection and the backing of management, who valued employees who kept flights on schedule and complaints to a minimum. Rodriguez opened the cockpit door and stepped into first class, immediately sensing the electric tension that filled the cabin like static before a storm. Passengers were holding phones, recording everything. The Hispanic family across the aisle was speaking rapidly in Spanish, clearly agitated. Even the business travelers who usually minded their own affairs were paying attention. Tommy Martinez, still live streaming, turned his phone toward the captain. "Captain, we have over 10,000 people watching this live. Everyone here can testify that this passenger has been completely cooperative and polite, but your flight attendant has been interrogating her for being black in first class." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. 10,000 people. This wasn't just an internal crew dispute anymore. This was a public relations nightmare that could destroy careers and shut down airlines. He looked at Jasmine sitting calmly in 14C with her hands folded, then at Rachel, whose face was flushed with anger and something that might have been desperation. Ms. Coleman Rodriguez said carefully, "Can you walk me through the situation?" Rachel launched into her prepared narrative, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Captain, the passenger in 14C has been unable to adequately verify her ticket purchase. When asked for additional documentation, she became defensive and argumentative. She has been disruptive to other passengers, and I believe she represents a security risk." "That's a complete lie," Tommy said, his phone still recording. Everyone here witnessed her being polite and cooperative while this flight attendant interrogated her about her race, her finances, and her family. "Sir, please lower your voice," Rodriguez said diplomatically, though he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Katie Walsh stepped forward, her young face pale but determined. "Captain, I need to file an official report. I witnessed Ms. Coleman discriminate against the passenger in 14C based on her race. The passenger provided all required documentation, but Ms. Coleman continued to harass her and make discriminatory comments." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Rodriguez looked around the cabin, seeing passengers nodding in agreement with Katie's assessment. This wasn't a he said, she said situation. This was a he said, she said, and 40 other people said situation. Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal, spoke up from row 15. "Captain, I'm a federal air marshal. I've been watching this entire situation unfold. In my professional opinion, this passenger has been subjected to discriminatory treatment that violates federal aviation regulations." Rodriguez felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. A federal air marshal was now officially weighing in on the situation. This was no longer just about customer service or crew disputes. This was about federal law. "Ma'am Rodriguez," said to Jasmine, "I apologize for any inconvenience. Can you tell me your version of events?" Jasmine looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "Captain, I boarded this aircraft with a valid boarding pass and took my assigned seat. When questioned, I provided my boarding pass, driver's license, and credit card. I answered personal questions about my family, my finances, and my travel plans. I have been cooperative and polite throughout this interaction." Her voice was steady, professional, and completely credible. Rodriguez could see why passengers were rallying to her defense. "She's lying," Rachel burst out. She was defensive from the moment I asked her first question. She got angry when I requested additional verification. Rachel Rodriguez said firmly, "I need you to step into the galley with me." As they moved toward the back of First Class, Tommy's live stream captured every moment. The viewer count had climbed past 12,000, and hashtag Skystream447 was trending nationally on Twitter. In the galley, Rodriguez looked at Rachel seriously. "Walk me through your reasoning for questioning this passenger. She doesn't belong in first class," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Look at her clothes, Luis. Look at her bag. That's not a first-class passenger," Rachel Rodriguez said quietly. "Are you hearing yourself right now? You're telling me you profiled a passenger based on her appearance." "I'm telling you I used my professional judgment to identify a potential fraud situation," Rachel replied defensively. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I know when something doesn't add up. What doesn't add up? She has a valid boarding pass, valid ID, and the credit card used to purchase the ticket. What exactly is fraudulent about that?" Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. because there was no good answer to that question. There was no evidence of fraud, no indication of wrongdoing, no justification for the interrogation, except for the one thing she couldn't say out loud: she believed black people didn't belong in first class. Back in the cabin, Jasmine was having a very different conversation with Katie Walsh. "I want you to know," Katie said quietly, "that not all of us think like she does. This is wrong, and I'm going to make sure it's documented properly." Jasmine smiled slightly. "You showed courage today. That matters more than you know." "I just can't stand watching someone be treated like that," Katie replied. "It's not right." "No," Jasmine agreed, "it's not right. But you did something about it. That's what matters." What Katie didn't know was that her courage was being documented in ways she couldn't imagine. Her willingness to stand up to a senior colleague, to risk her own job to defend a stranger, was exactly the kind of behavior that would be remembered when this investigation was complete. As Captain Rodriguez returned from his galley consultation with Rachel, the energy in the cabin had shifted from uncomfortable tension to barely contained outrage. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were participating, speaking up, demanding answers. Tommy's live stream had become a phenomenon. Viewer count approaching 15,000, comments flooding in faster than anyone could read them. Local news stations in multiple cities were monitoring the stream, preparing their own coverage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a difficult decision. "I want to assure you that Skystream Airlines takes all passenger concerns seriously. We are investigating this situation and will take appropriate action." "What about right now?" called out Mr. Davidson from 13D. "This woman has been humiliated in front of all of us. What are you going to do about it right now?" Rodriguez felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on him. The off-duty air marshal was watching. The junior flight attendant was watching. Thousands of people online were watching. And somewhere in corporate headquarters, his bosses were probably watching too. "I am going to personally ensure that all passengers are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve for the remainder of this flight," he said carefully. It was a diplomatic answer that satisfied no one. "That's not enough," said Maria Santos from row 15. "This flight attendant needs to be removed from duty immediately. She has violated federal anti-discrimination laws and created a hostile environment for passengers." Rachel, who had been standing silently in the galley, couldn't contain herself anymore. "I have done nothing wrong," she shouted loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I was following company security protocols." "What security protocols require passengers to explain their family medical situations?" Tommy asked, his phone still recording. "What security protocols involve commenting on someone's clothing or financial status?" Rachel's mouth opened, but no answer came. Because there were no such protocols. There never had been. Jasmine sat in 14C watching the situation escalate around her with the trained eye of a federal investigator. She was documenting everything: the captain's hesitation to take decisive action, Rachel's inability to justify her behavior, the company's apparent lack of proper anti-discrimination training, and the courage of passengers and crew members who were willing to speak up for what was right. But she was also watching the clock. Her cover was holding, but barely. Soon someone would start asking deeper questions about Monica Davis, the nervous librarian from Atlanta. Soon the investigation would have to move from covert to overt. Katie Walsh approached Jasmine's seat, her young face serious. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I've filed an incident report with the captain. Your treatment today was unacceptable and there will be consequences." "Thank you," Jasmine replied softly. "You risked a lot to stand up for me." Why, Katie thought for a moment. "Because my mom always told me that staying silent makes you part of the problem. And this," she gestured around the cabin, "this is definitely a problem." From the galley, Rachel was making one final play for authority. She picked up the cabin phone and dialed a number that would change everything. "Skystream Corporate. This is Flight 447, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I need to speak with CEO Mitchell immediately. We have a situation." Tommy's chat exploded. "She's calling the CEO. This is about to get crazy." CEO needs to fire her now. Justice for 14C. Within 30 seconds, the phone rang back. Rachel answered on speaker, apparently not realizing that the entire first-class cabin could hear both sides of the conversation. Coleman, this is Brandon Mitchell. What's the situation? Mr. Mitchell, we have a disruptive passenger in first class who has been unable to adequately verify her ticket purchase. The situation has escalated, and I'm requesting permission to have her removed upon landing. There was a pause. Then Mitchell's voice came through the speakers. Coleman, I'm watching a live stream of your flight right now. It has 18,000 viewers, and it's trending on Twitter. From what I can see, you've been harassing a passenger for sitting in her assigned seat. Is that accurate? Rachel's face went white. The CEO was watching. The CEO knew. The CEO was not supporting her. Sir, I was following security protocols. What? Security protocols. Coleman, I want you to tell me exactly which company policy authorizes you to interrogate passengers about their financial status or comment on their clothing. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Coleman, are you there? Yes, sir. Answer the question. Which policy I was using my professional judgment to assess a potential fraud situation. Based on what evidence? Another long silence. Coleman, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Report to Captain Rodriguez, who will escort you to a passenger seat for the remainder of the flight. When we land, you will report to corporate headquarters for a disciplinary hearing. The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Rachel Coleman, who had strutted around the aircraft like an absolute authority just minutes before, had been publicly fired by the CEO of the airline. Tommy's live stream exploded past 20,000 viewers. The chat was moving so fast it was impossible to read individual comments, but the overall sentiment was clear justice was being served. Rachel looked around the cabin, seeing faces that ranged from satisfaction to pity to outright hostility. 22 years of airline service had ended with a phone call that everyone could hear. Ms. Coleman, Captain Rodriguez said gently, "Please take seat 16F for the remainder of the flight." As Rachel walked down the aisle toward the back of first class, passing the woman she had tried to humiliate, Jasmine looked up and made eye contact. Rachel, Jasmine said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby passengers to hear, "You had the power to make this flight better for everyone. Instead, you chose to use that power to hurt someone. That choice was yours, and these consequences are yours too." Rachel's step faltered. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, to explain that she was just doing her job, but she couldn't find the words. Because deep down, she knew Jasmine was right. As the disgraced flight attendant settled into her passenger seat, Flight 447 continued toward Denver. But everyone on board understood that something fundamental had changed. They had witnessed discrimination in real time. They had seen ordinary people find the courage to speak up. They had watched authority built on prejudice crumble when confronted with basic human decency. What they didn't know was that the woman in 14C had the power to do much more than end one flight attendant's career. She had the power to ground an entire airline, and she was about to use it. The aftermath of Rachel Coleman's termination should have brought peace to Flight 447. Instead, it brought something far more dangerous, a wounded animal's last desperate attack. From her seat in 16F, Rachel stewed in humiliation and rage. 22 years of service ended with a public firing that 20,000 people had witnessed live. Her career was over. Her reputation destroyed, all because she had tried to maintain standards. All because she had questioned someone who clearly didn't belong. In Rachel's mind, none of this was her fault. It was all the fault of the woman in 14C who had somehow manipulated the situation to make herself look like a victim. Tommy Martinez's live stream had become the most watched aviation incident in social media history. The viewer count had stabilized around 25,000, with people tuning in from around the world. The hashtags, #SkyStream447 and #RacistFlightAttendant, were trending globally, and news organizations were scrambling to get their own crews to Denver International Airport. But Rachel wasn't done fighting. She pulled out her personal phone and began typing furiously, crafting a narrative that would save her reputation and destroy the woman who had humiliated her. Her fingers moved across the screen with desperate precision, composing posts across multiple social media platforms. Forced to question suspicious passenger after fraudulent documentation, she typed on Facebook. Targeted by liberal mob for doing my job. 22 years of service destroyed by political correctness. On Twitter, airline throws dedicated employee under the bus to appease mob. Passenger couldn't verify legitimate purchase. Security protocols exist for a reason. On Instagram, she posted a photo of herself in uniform with the caption, "When doing your job becomes a crime. Pray for airline safety when crew members are afraid to ask questions." Within minutes, her posts began gaining traction. Not among the mainstream audience watching Tommy's stream, but among groups that specialized in turning perpetrators into victims. Right-wing blogs picked up her narrative. Conservative social media influencers began amplifying her story. The phrase, "cancel culture strikes again," started trending alongside the original hashtags. In the cabin, Jasmine watched this counter-narrative develop in real time through the comments on Tommy's stream. She had seen this pattern before during other investigations. When caught in obvious wrongdoing, some people doubled down, creating alternate realities where they were the heroes and their victims were the villains. "Check this out." Tommy set his phone, capturing both the cabin and his screen. The flight attendant is now claiming she was fired for asking questions about security. She's saying the passenger couldn't verify her ticket purchase. Passengers around him shook their heads in disbelief. They had witnessed the entire interaction. They knew Rachel's version was a complete fabrication. "That's not what happened," said Maria Santos from row 15. "I'm a federal air marshal and I can testify that the passenger provided all required documentation immediately when asked." The discrimination was obvious and inexcusable. But Rachel's false narrative was gaining momentum online. Conservative news websites began publishing stories about political correctness destroying airline security. Radio talk show hosts started taking calls from listeners who supported Rachel's right to ask questions. The battle was no longer just happening on Flight 447. It was happening across the entire internet, with two completely different versions of reality competing for dominance. In first class, Jasmine felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She had dealt with this phenomenon before, the way obvious discrimination could be reframed as reasonable security measures, the way perpetrators could become victims in the span of a few social media posts. But this time was different. This time, everything had been documented in real time by multiple sources. This time, there were dozens of witnesses who couldn't be silenced or discredited. This time, she had the power to do more than just file a report and hope for justice. Katie Walsh approached Jasmine's seat, her young face troubled. "Ms. Davis, I'm seeing some of what she's posting online. It's completely different from what actually happened. Are you okay?" Jasmine smiled sadly. "I've been through this before, Katie. When some people get caught doing something wrong, they don't apologize. They attack. They lie. They try to make you look like the problem. But everyone here knows the truth," Katie protested. "We all saw what really happened." "Truth and narrative are different things," Jasmine replied. "The truth is what happened. The narrative is the story people choose to believe. And some people will always choose to believe that discrimination is justified if you just call it something else." As if summoned by their conversation, Rachel Coleman stood up from her seat in 16F and began walking toward the front of the cabin. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with the kind of desperation that comes from having nothing left to lose. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced loudly, her voice carrying throughout first class and into economy. "I need you all to know that what you witnessed today was not discrimination. It was security. And now, because of political correctness and mob justice, your safety is at risk." Tommy immediately turned his phone toward Rachel, capturing her impromptu speech for his 25,000 viewers. This passenger, Rachel continued pointing directly at Jasmine, was unable to adequately explain how she afforded a first-class ticket. She became defensive when asked reasonable questions. She refused to cooperate with standard security protocols. "That's a lie," called out Mr. Davidson from 13D. "I watched the whole thing. She answered every question politely and showed you everything you asked for." "You don't understand aviation security," Rachel shot back. "You don't know what to look for." "I do. And I'm telling you that passenger is not who she claims to be." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Rachel was now directly claiming that Jasmine was traveling under false pretenses that she was some sort of fraud or security threat. "Prove it," said Maria Santos, her federal air marshal training evident in her direct challenge. "Make a specific accusation backed by evidence or sit down and be quiet." Rachel's eyes blazed with fury. "I don't have to prove anything to you people. I know what I know. And what I know is that this entire situation has been orchestrated to destroy good people who are just trying to do their jobs." Tommy's chat was exploding. "She's lost her mind. Security threat. She's the threat. Someone stop this crazy woman." Mental breakdown happening live. Captain Rodriguez had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit, but Rachel's public meltdown forced him to intervene again. He emerged from the flight deck with the firm stride of someone who had had enough. "Miss Coleman," he said authoritatively, "you are no longer a crew member on this aircraft. You are a passenger, and you are causing a disturbance. Return to your seat immediately, or you will be restrained for the safety of other passengers." "You can't silence me," Rachel replied, her voice rising to near hysteria. "These people have a right to know the truth. They have a right to know that airline security has been compromised by political correctness." That's when Jasmine made a decision that would change everything. She had maintained her cover for over an hour, documenting discrimination while pretending to be a nervous librarian. But Rachel's public accusations had crossed a line from harassment to potentially dangerous conspiracy theories. Jasmine stood up from 14C, her posture subtly shifting from uncertain to authoritative. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, professional, confident, and utterly commanding. "Ms. Coleman," Jasmine said, her words cutting through Rachel's hysteria like a laser. "You keep saying I'm not who I claim to be. You're absolutely right about that. But you're wrong about everything else." The cabin fell silent. Every phone was recording. Tommy's 25,000 viewers held their collective breath. "My name is not Monica Davis." Jasmine continued reaching into her purse with deliberate precision. "And you're about to find out exactly who I really am." In the Skystream Airlines corporate headquarters in Dallas, CEO Brandon Mitchell was experiencing the worst day of his professional life. What had started as a routine Tuesday morning had exploded into a public relations catastrophe that was threatening to destroy his company. The live stream from Flight 447 was now being monitored by his entire crisis management team. The viewer count had climbed past 30,000. Major news networks were picking up the story. And his company's stock price was in free fall, dropping 15% in the 2 hours since the incident began. Mitchell stared at the wall of monitors in the crisis room, watching multiple live streams, news feeds, and social media analytics in real time. The hashtags, #SkyStream447 and #RacistFlightAttendant were trending in over 20 countries. Celebrities were weighing in, politicians were demanding investigations, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. "Sir," said Jennifer Lopez, his head of communications, "we need to get ahead of this. The narrative is getting away from us." Mitchell nodded grimly. He had already fired Rachel Coleman in the most public way possible, hoping to contain the damage. But instead of ending the story, it seemed to have made it bigger. Now his former employee was claiming she had been railroaded for doing her job, and that narrative was gaining traction among certain audiences. "What's our position?" Mitchell asked his legal team. "Officially, We support our captain's decision to remove a crew member who violated company anti-discrimination policies, replied Sarah Johnson, the chief legal counsel. Unofficially, we're scared to death of the federal investigation this is going to trigger. What federal investigation? Brandon, a passenger, was discriminated against on our aircraft in front of dozens of witnesses while being live-streamed to tens of thousands of viewers. The Department of Transportation is going to crawl so far up our company that we'll need surgery to remove them. Mitchell rubbed his temples. Skystream had built its reputation on being the no-frills efficient airline that got people from point A to point B without the pretense of traditional carriers. They had cut costs everywhere, including diversity training, customer service protocols, and the kind of sensitivity education that prevented incidents like this. Now that cost-cutting was coming back to haunt them. "Get me Captain Rodriguez on the line," Mitchell ordered. "I need to know exactly what's happening on that plane." Within moments, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the conference room speakers. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Brandon Mitchell. I need a full briefing on the situation." "Sir, the situation is under control," Rodriguez replied carefully. "The passenger who was discriminated against has been very gracious. The crew member responsible has been removed from duty. We're maintaining course for Denver. Captain, I'm watching multiple live streams from your aircraft. The former flight attendant is now claiming the passenger is traveling under false pretenses. What's your assessment?" There was a pause. Then Rodriguez's voice more uncertain. "Sir, the passenger has provided all required documentation. Her boarding pass, ID, and credit card all match. I have no reason to believe she's anyone other than who she claims to be." But even as he said it, Rodriguez was beginning to have doubts. There was something about the woman in 14C that didn't quite add up. Her calm under pressure was almost professional. Her questions about airline policies were unusually sophisticated, and the way she had handled the discrimination suggested someone with experience dealing with these situations. On the live stream, Tommy was capturing the tense moment as Jasmine stood in the aisle, having just announced that she wasn't who she claimed to be. Mitchell watched in horror as his crisis situation was about to become something exponentially worse. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Jasmine's voice through the speakers, clearer and more authoritative than she had sounded all day. "My name is Dr. Jasmine Brooks. I am a senior inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration National Covert Auditing Division." The words hit the corporate crisis room like a nuclear bomb. "Holy shit," whispered someone in the back of the room. "Did she just say FAA?" asked another voice. "We're dead," Lopez concluded simply. Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. The passenger who had been discriminated against wasn't just any passenger. She was a federal aviation inspector, conducting a covert audit of his airline. Rodriguez Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you copy that?" "Yes, sir," came the captain's stunned reply. "She's FAA." In the cabin of Flight 447, the revelation had created a moment of absolute silence. Rachel Coleman, who had been ranting about security threats and false identities, stood frozen as the reality of her situation became clear. She hadn't just discriminated against a passenger. She had discriminated against a federal inspector who had the power to ground the entire airline. Tommy's live stream exploded past 40,000 viewers. The chat was moving so fast it was impossible to read individual comments, but the overall sentiment was clear. This was the moment when karma delivered justice in the most spectacular way possible. "Dr. Brooks," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the respect due to a federal official. "I apologize on behalf of Skystream Airlines for the treatment you received today." Jasmine reached into her purse and pulled out her FAA credentials, holding them up for the cabin to see. "Captain Rodriguez, I want to be clear that my treatment today was not an exception to your company's culture. It was a perfect example of it." She turned to face the passengers, many of whom were still recording. Ladies and gentlemen, I am conducting a covert audit of Skystream Airlines based on numerous complaints of discriminatory behavior. What you witnessed today is exactly the kind of treatment that prompted this federal investigation. Rachel Coleman's knees buckled. She grabbed the back of a seat for support as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. She hadn't just lost her job, she had potentially destroyed an entire airline. In the corporate crisis room, Mitchell was having his own moment of reckoning. "How bad is this?" he asked his legal team. "On a scale of 1 to 10, this is about a 15, Johnson replied. "We just had an FAA inspector document bias discrimination while being live-streamed to tens of thousands of people. Our operating certificate is probably going to be suspended within hours." Mitchell looked around the room at his senior staff, seeing his own panic reflected in their faces. "What are our options?" "Damage control," Lopez said. "Full cooperation with the investigation. Public apology. Immediate implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination training. And pray that Dr. Brooks is feeling merciful." But even as she said it, everyone in the room knew it was too little too late. The damage had been done in the most public way possible, and there was no amount of crisis management that could undo what the world had witnessed. On Flight 447, Dr. Jasmine Brooks was just getting started. The moment Dr. Jasmine Brooks revealed her true identity, the entire dynamic aboard Flight 447 shifted like tectonic plates finding a new equilibrium. What had been a passenger discrimination incident was now a federal case involving obstruction of a government investigation. Tommy Martinez, his hands shaking with adrenaline, adjusted his phone to capture every moment. His live stream audience had exploded past 50,000 viewers, and he knew he was documenting aviation history. "Y'all," he whispered into his phone, "I can't believe what we're witnessing right now. A federal inspector just revealed that she's been conducting an undercover audit, and she caught this entire airline discriminating against her live on camera." Captain Rodriguez approached Dr. Brooks with the careful respect due to a federal official who had just documented his airline committing federal crimes. "Dr. Brooks," he said formally, "what are your instructions?" Jasmine's transformation was complete. Gone was the nervous librarian persona. In its place stood a woman with 20 years of federal aviation experience and the authority to ground airlines that failed to meet basic standards of human decency. "Captain, I need you to contact Denver Tower and request that law enforcement meet this aircraft upon arrival. We have potential federal crimes to investigate, including discrimination, obstruction of a federal investigation, and filing false reports." Rodriguez nodded grimly. He keyed his radio, "Denver Tower Skystream 447, requesting law enforcement meet aircraft upon arrival. We have federal officials on board requiring assistance with potential criminal investigation. Copy, Skystream 447. Denver Airport Police and FBI will meet your aircraft at Gate B15. The words FBI sent a shockwave through the cabin. This was no longer just about bad customer service or even discrimination. This was about federal crimes. Rachel Coleman, still standing in the aisle, finally grasped the magnitude of her situation. She hadn't just harassed a passenger, she had obstructed a federal investigation while being live-streamed to tens of thousands of witnesses. "This is entrapment," she shouted desperately. "You tricked me. This isn't fair." Dr. Brooks turned to face Rachel with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with desperate criminals before. "Ms. Coleman, entrapment is when a law enforcement officer induces someone to commit a crime they otherwise wouldn't have committed. I didn't induce you to discriminate against me. I simply existed as a black woman in first class, and you revealed your true character." The legal precision of her words hit Rachel like a physical blow. Every excuse, every justification she had constructed was crumbling under the weight of actual legal knowledge. Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal, stood up from row 15. "Dr. Brooks, I'm Federal Air Marshal Maria Santos. I witnessed the entire incident and can provide official testimony regarding the discrimination and false accusations." "Thank you, Marshal Santos. Your testimony will be valuable in the federal investigation." Tommy's chat was exploding with viewers trying to process what they were witnessing. A federal inspector and an air marshal on the same flight. This flight attendant is going to prison. Justice is being served at 30,000 feet. This is better than any movie. Katie Walsh, the junior flight attendant who had risked her job to defend Dr. Brooks, approached with tears in her eyes. Dr. Brooks, I'm so sorry for what you experienced. I should have done more to stop it. Jasmine's expression softened. Katie, you showed more courage than crew members with decades of experience. You put your job on the line to defend a stranger. That matters more than you know. What's going to happen to the airline? Katie asked. That depends on what our investigation reveals, Jasmine replied. But based on what I've documented today, Skystream Airlines has serious cultural problems that go far beyond one discriminatory flight attendant. In the Skystream corporate crisis room, CEO Brandon Mitchell was watching his company implode in real time. The live stream had become must-see television, with news networks providing live commentary on what was being called the flight heard round the world. Sir, said his communications director, we're getting calls from every major news outlet in the country. Congress is already talking about hearings, and our stock is down 40% since trading opened. Mitchell stared at the monitors showing his airline's destruction being broadcast to the world. How long before the FAA grounds us? Sir, said his legal counsel, they probably could have grounded us an hour ago. The fact that Dr. Brooks is letting this flight continue to Denver suggests she's being remarkably professional about this. Professional or not. We're finished, Mitchell said quietly. No airline survives this kind of federal investigation, especially when it's broadcast live to 60,000 people. Back on Flight 447, Dr. Brooks was conducting what amounted to a public seminar on federal aviation law and civil rights. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the cabin, what you witnessed today represents a pattern of behavior that the FAA has been investigating for months. Your testimony will be crucial in ensuring that this kind of discrimination doesn't happen to other passengers. She turned to address Tommy's live stream directly, knowing that her words would reach far beyond the confines of the aircraft. To everyone watching this live, I want you to understand something important. Discrimination in aviation isn't just wrong morally. It's dangerous operationally. When crew members make decisions based on prejudice instead of facts, when they treat passengers differently based on race instead of behavior, they compromise the safety of everyone on board. How so? Tommy asked, his phone capturing every word. Because discrimination clouds judgment. A flight attendant who is focused on harassing a passenger because of their race might miss actual security threats. A crew member who files false reports destroys the trust and communication necessary for safe operations. Prejudice doesn't just hurt individuals, it undermines the entire system. The explanation was being heard by aviation professionals around the world, many of whom were nodding in recognition of the safety implications they had never considered. Rachel Coleman, listening from her seat in 16F, felt the last of her defenses crumble. Dr. Brooks wasn't just explaining why discrimination was wrong, she was explaining why it was dangerous, and Rachel had demonstrated every single failure mode in front of the largest audience in aviation history. As Flight 447 began its descent into Denver, everyone on board understood that they were about to witness the conclusion of one of the most significant civil rights moments in aviation history. The FBI was waiting. The cameras were rolling, and justice was about to be served. As Flight 447 began its descent into Denver, the weight of what had transpired was settling over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Passengers sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that they had just witnessed a federal inspector document bias discrimination while being live-streamed to what was now approaching 70,000 viewers worldwide. Katie Walsh stood in the galley staring out the small window at the approaching lights of Denver International Airport. In less than 3 weeks on the job, she had gone from serving drinks and checking seatbelts to becoming a key witness in what was shaping up to be the most significant aviation civil rights case in decades. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Honey, are you okay? You're all over the news. We're so proud of you for standing up for what's right." Katie realized that her decision to challenge Rachel Coleman hadn't just been witnessed by the passengers on Flight 447. It had been seen by tens of thousands of people online, and now news outlets were picking up the story of the young flight attendant who risked her job to defend a stranger. From her seat in 14C, Dr. Jasmine Brooks was conducting what amounted to a mobile federal investigation. She had her notebook out, documenting everything: Times quotes, witness names, policy violations. 20 years of federal investigative experience had taught her that cases were won or lost on the quality of documentation, and this case was being documented in real time by multiple sources. Dr. Brooks said, "Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal. I've been thinking about the broader implications of what we witnessed today. This wasn't just one bad employee. The company policies, the lack of intervention from management. The captain's initial hesitation to act, this suggests institutional failures." Jasmine nodded grimly. "That's exactly what my investigation has been focused on. Marshal Santos. Ms. Coleman's behavior was egregious, but it was enabled by a corporate culture that prioritizes compliance over compassion, authority over accountability." Tommy Martinez, still live streaming, overheard the conversation. "Dr. Brooks, can you explain to everyone watching what you mean by institutional failures?" Jasmine looked directly at the camera, knowing her words would be dissected by aviation experts, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates around the world. When discrimination happens in aviation, it's rarely just one person acting alone. It requires a system that allows bias to flourish. In this case, we saw a senior flight attendant who felt empowered to harass a passenger based on race. We saw a captain who initially hesitated to intervene. We saw company policies that were vague enough to allow discriminatory interpretation. And we saw a corporate culture that had clearly failed to provide adequate training on civil rights and professional behavior. She paused, letting her words sink in for both the cabin and the live stream audience. Most importantly, we saw what happens when discrimination is challenged. Ms. Coleman didn't apologize or reconsider her actions. She doubled down, made false accusations, and attempted to destroy the reputation of the person she had victimized. That's not the behavior of someone who made an honest mistake. That's the behavior of someone who believes discrimination is justified. Rachel Coleman. Listening from 16F felt each word like a physical blow. Dr. Brooks was methodically destroying every justification she had constructed for her behavior. Worse, she was doing it with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades studying exactly this kind of misconduct. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Denver International Airport. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing." But the real drama wasn't in the descent. It was in what was waiting on the ground. Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see the unusual activity at the airport. Multiple law enforcement vehicles surrounded Gate B-15. News vans lined the perimeter. Television crews had set up positions to capture the aircraft's arrival. "Holy crap," Tommy whispered into his live stream. "There are FBI agents down there? This is really happening." Dr. Brooks stood and addressed the cabin one final time before landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your courage today. Many of you spoke up when you saw injustice. You recorded what happened. You refused to let discrimination happen in silence. That courage is going to change how airlines operate." She looked directly at Katie Walsh. "Especially you, Katie. You risked your job to defend a stranger. That's the kind of character that makes aviation safer for everyone." Katie felt tears in her eyes. "I just couldn't watch it happen and do nothing." "That's exactly the right response," Dr. Brooks replied. and it's exactly what was missing from Ms. Coleman's training and from this airline's culture. As the aircraft touched down at Denver International Airport, Tommy's live stream reached its peak. Viewership: 85,000 people watching live as the most documented case of airline discrimination in history came to its conclusion. The wheels touched the runway with the kind of gentle precision that Captain Rodriguez was famous for. But everyone on board knew that this landing was unlike any other in aviation history. FBI agents were waiting. Federal charges were likely. An entire airline was about to be held accountable for institutional discrimination, and it had all been broadcast live to nearly 100,000 people around the world. As Flight 447 taxied toward Gate B-15, the world outside had transformed into a media circus, unlike anything Denver International Airport had ever seen. Tommy Martinez's live stream had become the focal point of a global conversation about discrimination, justice, and accountability. The hashtags, #SkyStream447, #RacistFlightAttendant, and #JusticeAt30,000 feet were trending in over 30 countries. Celebrity voices were amplifying the story across multiple platforms. News organizations from CNN to BBC were providing live coverage of the aircraft's arrival. Tommy adjusted his phone to capture the scene outside the windows. "Y'all, I cannot believe what I'm seeing down there. There have got to be 50 news crews, FBI agents, airport police. This is insane." His viewer count had stabilized around 95,000, but the real impact was happening across the broader internet. The story had been picked up by every major news outlet, shared by celebrities with millions of followers, and discussed in corporate boardrooms across the aviation industry. In the Skystream Airlines corporate headquarters, CEO Brandon Mitchell was experiencing the complete collapse of everything he had built. His phone screen showed the real-time destruction of his company's reputation. Stock down 52% in after-hours trading. Calls for congressional investigation from multiple senators. Department of Transportation announcing immediate review of Skystream's operating certificate. Social media filled with travelers sharing their own stories of discrimination on Skystream flights. "Sir," said his communications director, "we need to get ahead of this with a public statement." "What are we going to say?" Mitchell asked desperately. "That we're sorry our employee discriminated against a federal inspector while being live-streamed to 100,000 people. That we had no idea our company culture was enabling this kind of behavior." Something like that. "Yes." Mitchell stared at the monitors showing his airline's destruction being broadcast live around the world. "Draft something. Full apology. Complete cooperation with federal investigation. Immediate implementation of comprehensive reforms. And pray that it's enough to keep us from being shut down entirely." But everyone in the crisis room knew it wouldn't be enough. The damage was beyond any public relations strategy. On Flight 447, Dr. Brooks was preparing for the most public conclusion to a federal investigation in aviation history. She had conducted dozens of covert audits, but none had ever been documented in real time by multiple sources and witnessed by nearly 100,000 people worldwide. Dr. Brooks said, "Maria Santos, I've been in federal law enforcement for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this. The documentation you've gathered today is unprecedented." "It's not just the documentation," Jasmine replied. "It's the witnesses. It's the real-time evidence. It's the fact that everything was captured by multiple sources and can never be denied or disputed." She looked around the cabin at the passengers who had become unwitting participants in aviation history. "Most discrimination cases come down to he said, she said arguments. Victims struggle to prove what happened because there are few witnesses and little documentation. Today is different. Today, discrimination was caught in the act in real time with perfect documentation and dozens of witnesses." Tommy's phone captured her words for his massive audience. "So what happens now?" Now, Dr. Brooks said with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 2 decades enforcing federal aviation law. "There are consequences." As the aircraft reached the gate, Passengers could see the full extent of the law enforcement presence waiting for them. FBI agents in their distinctive blue windbreakers, Denver police officers, airport security, federal aviation investigators. Ladies and gentlemen, came Captain Rodriguez's voice over the intercom. We have arrived at gate B-15. Federal law enforcement officials will be boarding the aircraft first to conduct official business. Please remain in your seats until cleared by the authorities. The gravity of the moment settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just the end of a flight. This was the beginning of a federal case that would reshape how airlines treat passengers. Rachel Coleman sat in 16F staring out the window at the FBI agents preparing to board. 22 years of airline service had led to this moment, federal agents coming to arrest her for discrimination that had been witnessed by nearly 100,000 people worldwide. Her phone buzzed with notifications, text messages from family members who had seen the news, social media alerts about her name trending globally, voice messages from friends asking if it was really her on the viral video. She opened Twitter and saw her name paired with phrases like racist flight attendant and federal charges. The narrative she had tried to construct that she was a dedicated employee railroaded by political correctness had been completely overwhelmed by the documented evidence of her discrimination. Katie Walsh looked out the window at the media circus and felt a mixture of fear and pride. Fear because she knew her life was about to change dramatically. Pride because she had done the right thing when it mattered most. Katie Dr. Brooks said, approaching her seat, "You're going to be asked to give testimony about what you witnessed today. I want you to know that there are federal protections for employees who report discrimination. Your job is protected, and your courage is going to help ensure this doesn't happen to other passengers." "Thank you," Katie replied softly. "I'm scared, but I'm glad I spoke up. Being scared is normal. Being brave despite being scared is heroic." As federal agents began boarding the aircraft, Tommy made one final address to his live stream audience. "Y'all, we just witnessed something incredible. We saw discrimination happen in real time. We saw ordinary people find the courage to speak up. We saw a federal inspector reveal institutional problems with airline culture. And we saw justice begin to be served." He paused, looking around the cabin that had become the center of a global conversation about civil rights. This isn't just about one racist flight attendant or one bad airline. This is about all of us. It's about whether we speak up when we see injustice. It's about whether we hold institutions accountable when they fail to treat people with basic dignity. The first FBI agent stepped onto the aircraft badge, clearly visible expression serious and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I'm Special Agent Robert Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're here to conduct interviews regarding potential civil rights violations and obstruction of a federal investigation." The words made it official. This wasn't just a viral video anymore. This was a federal criminal case. And it had all started because a flight attendant looked at a black woman in first class and decided she didn't belong. Special Agent Robert Chen moved through the cabin with the methodical precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of federal investigations. Behind him, 3 additional agents and 2 Denver police officers created an atmosphere of serious law enforcement activity that would have been unthinkable on a routine commercial flight. Tommy Martinez, still live streaming, captured every moment for his audience of nearly 100,000 viewers worldwide. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen in 15 years of travel blogging," he whispered to his camera. "Federal agents are conducting interviews on the aircraft. This discrimination case has become a federal criminal investigation in real time." Agent Chen approached Dr. Brooks first, showing her the respect due to a fellow federal investigator. "Dr. Brooks, I'm Special Agent Chen, FBI Civil Rights Division. We received notification of your investigation from FAA headquarters. Can you brief me on what transpired during this flight?" Jasmine handed him her official notebook filled with precise documentation of every discriminatory act every policy violation, every false accusation made by Rachel Coleman. Agent Chen. I've documented bias discrimination by Skystream Airlines crew members, obstruction of a federal investigation, filing of false security reports, and creation of a hostile environment for passengers based on race. Chen reviewed her notes with the trained eye of someone who specialized in civil rights violations. Dr. Brooks. This documentation is extraordinary. The level of detail combined with the video evidence and witness testimony makes this one of the strongest discrimination cases I've encountered. The strength of the case is largely due to the courage of passengers and crew members who spoke up. Jasmine replied, gesturing toward Katie Walsh and the passengers who had defended her. Without their willingness to intervene, this would have been just another buried complaint. Agent Chen turned to address the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to interview several witnesses to this incident. Your cooperation is appreciated and your testimony will be crucial in ensuring justice is served. He approached Katie Walsh first. Ms. Walsh, I understand you filed an official complaint against your senior colleague. Can you walk me through your observations? Katie's voice was steady despite her obvious nervousness. Agent Chen. I watched Ms. Coleman discriminate against Dr. Brooks from the moment she boarded. She questioned her about things that had nothing to do with security. She made comments about her appearance, her finances, and her family. When I tried to intervene, she threatened my job. Did you observe other passengers being subjected to similar scrutiny? No, sir. She was friendly and accommodating to white passengers, but hostile and suspicious toward Dr. Brooks from the beginning. Agent Chen made notes in his own investigative notebook. The contrast between his professional documentation and Rachel's desperate social media posts was stark. He moved to Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal. Marshal Santos, from your professional perspective, was the treatment of Dr. Brooks consistent with legitimate security procedures? Absolutely not, Maria replied firmly. Dr. Brooks provided all required documentation immediately when requested. The continued interrogation had no basis in security protocols and was clearly motivated by racial bias. In your professional opinion, did the flight attendant's behavior compromise aircraft security? Yes. When crew members focus on harassing innocent passengers instead of actual security threats, they create dangerous blind spots. Her false accusations and fabricated security reports undermined the trust and communication necessary for safe operations. Tommy captured every word for his massive livestream audience, knowing that this federal investigation was being documented in unprecedented detail. Agent Chen approached Rachel Coleman in 16F, where she sat surrounded by the wreckage of her career and reputation. Ms. Coleman, I'm investigating allegations of civil rights violations and obstruction of a federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent, but I'd like to hear your version of events. Rachel looked up with eyes that showed the strain of watching her entire life collapse in real time. Agent Chen, I was just doing my job. I've been with this airline for 22 years. I've never had any complaints about discrimination, Miss Coleman. We have video evidence of you making discriminatory comments, filing false security reports, and continuing to harass Dr. Brooks after she provided all requested documentation. How do you explain these actions? Rachel's mouth opened and closed several times, but no coherent explanation emerged. Because there was no explanation that could justify what tens of thousands of people had witnessed. I thought something was suspicious. Her story didn't add up. What specifically didn't add up? She had a valid boarding pass, valid identification, and the credit card used to purchase the ticket. What exactly was suspicious? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Because the only thing that had been suspicious to Rachel was a black woman sitting in first class. Dr. Brooks watched the interview process with professional satisfaction. She had conducted federal investigations for 2 decades, but this was the first time she had been able to document discrimination so thoroughly and with such overwhelming evidence. Agent Chen, she said, approaching the FBI investigator. There's something else you should know. This incident isn't isolated. My investigation has revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior by Skystream Airlines that goes beyond individual employees to institutional failures. She handed him a tablet containing months of investigation data, complaint patterns, internal communications training records that show gaps in civil rights education. Ms. Coleman's behavior today was enabled by a corporate culture that has failed to prevent discrimination. Agent Chen reviewed the data, his expression growing more serious with each page. Dr. Brooks, are you prepared to recommend federal action against Skystream Airlines' operating certificate? The question sent a shockwave through the cabin. An airline's operating certificate was its license to fly. Suspension meant grounding the entire fleet. Agent Chen, based on what I've documented, I believe Skystream Airlines has demonstrated an institutional inability to ensure equal treatment for all passengers. That represents a fundamental failure to meet federal aviation standards. Tommy's livestream audience watched in real time as a federal inspector recommended grounding an entire airline for discrimination. The implications were staggering. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Chen announced to the cabin, this investigation will continue at federal facilities. We appreciate your cooperation and your courage in speaking up when you witnessed injustice. As passengers prepared to deplane, everyone understood that they had witnessed something historic. Not just discrimination being exposed, but justice being served with unprecedented transparency and accountability. The woman who had been targeted for the color of her skin had revealed herself to be the federal inspector with the power to ground the airline that had failed to protect her, and 100,000 people around the world had watched it happen live. As federal agents completed their preliminary interviews aboard Flight 447, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from a routine commercial flight into the epicenter of what would become known as the most significant aviation civil rights case of the modern era. Dr. Jasmine Brooks stood in the aisle, no longer disguised as the nervous librarian Monica Davis. Her posture was commanding. Her voice carried federal authority, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had just completed a career-defining investigation. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the cabin and Tommy's live stream audience of 100,000 viewers, I want you to understand the full scope of what you witnessed today. She paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the cabin. For the past 6 months, the Federal Aviation Administration has been investigating Skystream Airlines following numerous complaints of discriminatory treatment toward minority passengers. What you witnessed today was not an exception to this airline's culture. It was a perfect demonstration of it. Tommy's phone captured every word as she continued. Ms. Coleman's behavior today revealed the exact pattern of bias that prompted our federal investigation. Hostile treatment of minority passengers, discriminatory interpretation of policies, false accusations designed to justify prejudicial actions, and institutional support for crew members who abuse their authority. Rachel Coleman, still seated in 16F under FBI supervision, felt each word like a nail in the coffin of her defense. Dr. Brooks wasn't just exposing her individual misconduct. She was revealing that her behavior was part of a larger institutional failure. The Federal Aviation Administration takes discrimination seriously because bias doesn't just hurt individual passengers. Dr. Brooks continued. It compromises the safety and security of everyone who flies. When crew members make decisions based on prejudice instead of facts, when they waste time harassing innocent passengers instead of focusing on actual security threats, they create dangerous conditions for all travelers. Agent Chen approached Dr. Brooks with official documentation. Dr. Brooks, based on your investigation and today's documented incidents, what is the FAA's preliminary recommendation? The question everyone had been waiting for. The federal inspector with the power to ground airlines was about to announce her decision. Agent Chen, based on 6 months of investigation culminating in today's documented bias discrimination, I am recommending immediate suspension of Skystream Airlines' operating certificate pending a comprehensive review of their policies, training, and corporate culture. The words hit the cabin like a physical force. She was grounding the entire airline. Tommy's live stream chat exploded. She's shutting down the whole airline. Justice is served. This is history happening live, 100% deserved. But Dr. Brooks wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am recommending federal investigation into potential civil rights violations by Skystream management, bias, discrimination in hiring and training practices, and willful failure to comply with federal anti-discrimination regulations. She turned to address Tommy's camera directly, knowing her words would reach far beyond the confines of Flight 447. To everyone watching this live, I want you to understand something crucial. Civil rights in aviation aren't just about individual comfort. They're about creating a culture where every passenger is treated with dignity, where crew members focus on safety instead of bias, and where airlines understand that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally dangerous. Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the federal investigation, approached Dr. Brooks with obvious remorse. Dr. Brooks, on behalf of Skystream Airlines. I apologize for your treatment today. As captain of this aircraft, I should have intervened immediately and decisively. Jasmine looked at him with understanding rather than anger. Captain Rodriguez, your hesitation is exactly why institutional change is necessary. You're a good pilot and a decent person, but you operate within a system that hasn't properly equipped you to handle discrimination when you see it. What could I have done differently? You could have immediately removed Ms. Coleman from duty the moment she began harassing a passenger without cause. You could have documented her behavior officially, rather than hoping the situation would resolve itself. You could have protected your passenger from discrimination instead of protecting your crew member from consequences. Rodriguez nodded grimly. You're absolutely right. I failed in my duty to ensure all passengers were treated equally. Katie Walsh approached Dr. Brooks with tears in her eyes. Dr. Brooks, will I still have a job after all this? Jasmine smiled warmly. Katie, you're exactly the kind of crew member that aviation needs. You spoke up when you saw injustice. You put passengers' welfare ahead of crew hierarchy. Airlines that value integrity will be fighting to hire you, but Skystream is being shut down. Skystream's current management has demonstrated an inability to prevent discrimination, but the aviation industry needs people like you, people with the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Agent Chen concluded his preliminary investigation with an announcement that would reshape airline industry practices. Based on the evidence documented today, the FBI will be filing federal charges related to civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and filing false reports. This investigation will serve as a model for how discrimination in aviation will be prosecuted going forward. He looked around the cabin at the passengers who had witnessed history. Your courage in speaking up and documenting this incident has ensured that justice will be served and that meaningful change will occur. You should be proud of what you accomplished today. As passengers prepared to deplane, they understood that they weren't just ending a flight. They were concluding their role as witnesses to a moment that would be studied in civil rights courses discussed in corporate boardrooms, and remembered as the day when bias discrimination in aviation was exposed and held accountable in the most public way possible. Tommy Martinez addressed his audience one final time before ending his historic live stream. Y'all, we just witnessed something that will change aviation forever. We saw discrimination exposed in real time. We saw ordinary people find extraordinary courage. And we saw a federal inspector deliver justice at 30,000 feet. He paused, looking around the cabin that had become famous worldwide. Remember this moment. Remember that staying silent makes you part of the problem. Remember that speaking up changes everything. And remember that justice, when it finally arrives, is beautiful to witness. As the passengers of Flight 447 prepared to deplane Dr. Sarr, Jasmine Brooks was just beginning to exercise the full scope of her federal authority. What had started as a covert audit was about to become the most comprehensive airline investigation in Federal Aviation Administration history. Agent Chen received a priority message on his secure communication device and approached Dr. Brooks with an expression that conveyed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Dr. Brooks, I've just received confirmation from FAA headquarters and the Department of Transportation. You have full authorization to implement immediate action regarding SkyStream Airlines' operating status. Tommy Martinez, who had been preparing to end his live stream, immediately repositioned his phone to capture what he sensed would be the climactic moment of an already historic event. "Wait, y'all," he whispered to his audience of 95,000 viewers. "Something big is happening. The FBI agent just got some kind of official authorization." Dr. Brooks nodded to Agent Chen and addressed the cabin with the full authority of the federal government behind her words. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have just received authorization from Washington, D.C. to exercise emergency powers under Title 14 of the Federal Aviation Regulations." She paused, letting the significance of her words register with both the passengers and the live stream audience. "Effective immediately, I am issuing an emergency order of suspension for SkyStream Airlines operating certificate. All SkyStream aircraft currently in the air will be directed to land at the nearest suitable airport. All SkyStream flights scheduled for departure are hereby canceled. The airline is grounded pending a comprehensive federal investigation." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. She was shutting down an entire airline while being watched by nearly 100,000 people worldwide. Tommy's live stream chat exploded. "She just grounded an entire airline live. This is unprecedented. This is justice served in real time. Airlines everywhere are watching this." But Dr. Brooks wasn't finished exercising her authority. "Furthermore, I am initiating federal seizure of SkyStream's training records, hiring practices, internal communications, and financial records related to discrimination complaints. This investigation will determine whether violations of federal civil rights law warrant criminal prosecution of company executives." The implications were staggering. She wasn't just grounding planes. She was potentially sending executives to prison. Agent Chen, I need immediate contact with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Based on what I've documented today, we have grounds for federal prosecution under the Civil Rights Act. Rachel Coleman, sitting in 16F and watching her entire industry career end in the most public way possible, finally grasped the full magnitude of what she had triggered. Her discrimination against one passenger had led to the destruction of an entire airline. Katie Walsh raised her hand tentatively. "Dr. Brooks, what happens to the employees who weren't involved in discrimination? People like the pilots, mechanics, gate agents, who were just doing their jobs?" It was a compassionate question that showed Katie's character even in the midst of witnessing historic justice. Katie, federal law protects employees when their employers engage in illegal activities. The Department of Labor will ensure that innocent employees receive appropriate compensation and assistance finding new positions with airlines that maintain proper civil rights standards. She looked around the cabin at the passengers who had become unwitting participants in aviation history. "I also want you to know that your testimony today will be used to establish new industry-wide standards for preventing discrimination. Your courage to speak up will protect future passengers who might otherwise face the same treatment." Agent Chen received another priority communication and approached Dr. Brooks with update information. "Dr. Brooks, I have confirmation that all SkyStream flights have been notified of the grounding order. Currently, 47 aircraft are being diverted to emergency landings. The FAA is coordinating with other airlines to accommodate stranded passengers. What about SkyStream corporate headquarters? FBI teams are en route to secure records and interview executives. The CEO and senior management are being advised of potential federal charges. Tommy captured every word for his massive audience, knowing that he was documenting the real-time destruction of a major airline. Y'all, I can't believe what we're witnessing. Dr. Brooks isn't just punishing one racist flight attendant. She's dismantling an entire airline that enabled and protected discrimination. Brooks turned to address Tommy's camera directly, knowing that her words would be heard by aviation executives around the world. To airline management watching this live broadcast, understand that the Federal Aviation Administration will no longer tolerate bias discrimination. We have the authority to ground airlines, prosecute executives, and seize corporate assets. The era of treating civil rights violations as minor customer service issues is over. Her message was clear and unmistakable. Airlines that failed to prevent discrimination would face federal consequences that could destroy their companies. Captain Rodriguez, who had watched his airline collapse around him, approached Dr. Brooks with obvious distress. Dr. Brooks, I have to ask, was there anything I could have done to prevent this? Any action I could have taken that might have saved the airline? Jasmine looked at him with professional compassion. Captain, the problems with Skystream Airlines existed long before today. My investigation has revealed months of discriminatory incidents, failed training programs, and management decisions that prioritized cost-cutting over civil rights compliance. She gestured toward Rachel Coleman. Ms. Coleman's behavior today wasn't an aberration. It was the predictable result of institutional failures that your management chose to ignore. But surely there must have been warning signs. Captain, there were dozens of warning signs. Passenger complaints that were dismissed without investigation. Crew members who reported discriminatory behavior and were told to mind their own business. Training programs that taught policy compliance but ignored basic human dignity. Dr. Brooks pulled out her official tablet and showed him documentation that he had never seen. In the past 6 months, Skystream has received 47 complaints of racial discrimination from passengers. 47. None of them were investigated properly. None resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. Your airline treated civil rights violations as public relations problems instead of federal crimes. Rodriguez stared at the data with growing horror. I had no idea the complaints were that extensive. That's exactly the problem, Captain. Good people like you were kept in the dark while management enabled and protected discriminatory behavior. You can't fix problems you don't know exist. The conversation was being heard by thousands of aviation professionals worldwide, many of whom were beginning to understand how institutional discrimination operated in their own airlines. Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal, approached with a question that got to the heart of the broader implications. Dr. Brooks, will this investigation extend to other airlines? Are there similar patterns of discrimination throughout the industry? It was the question that airline executives around the world were dreading to hear answered. Marshal Santos, our investigation has already identified concerning patterns at multiple carriers. Skystream won't be the last airline to face federal scrutiny for civil rights violations. The words sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. This wasn't just about one airline or one incident. This was the beginning of comprehensive federal enforcement of civil rights in aviation. As passengers finally began to deplane, they understood that they had witnessed something far more significant than the end of a discrimination incident. They had seen the moment when the federal government decided to hold the entire aviation industry accountable for treating all passengers with dignity and respect. And it had all started because one federal inspector refused to accept that discrimination was just part of flying while black, as Dr. Jasmine Brooks stepped off Flight 447 and into the Denver International Airport terminal. She walked into a media firestorm that had been building for hours. The terminal buzzed with the controlled chaos of breaking news coverage, federal investigations, and the beginning of the most comprehensive aviation industry overhaul since 9/11. Tommy Martinez, his phone still capturing everything, documented the surreal scene for his audience of nearly 100,000 viewers who had followed the entire journey from routine flight to federal case study. "Y'all, this is absolutely insane," he whispered into his camera. "There are news crews from every major network, FBI agents everywhere, and federal investigators turning this airport into the center of a civil rights investigation that's already changing the aviation industry." The immediate consequences of Dr. Brooks's emergency grounding order were cascading through the aviation network in real time. Flight tracking websites showed 47 Skystream aircraft diverting to emergency landings across the country. Passengers stranded in airports were being accommodated by competing airlines. Stock markets were reacting to the first federal airline shutdown for civil rights violations in modern aviation history. But the deeper consequences were just beginning. Agent Chen approached Dr. Brooks as they moved through the terminal surrounded by federal security and media attention. "Dr. Brooks, I've received updates from our teams at Skystream headquarters. We've secured all training records, employee files, and internal communications. The preliminary review confirms your assessment of institutional discrimination." "What specific evidence have they found?" "Internal emails discussing passenger profiling strategies, training materials that contain coded language about certain types of travelers, complaint records that show a pattern of dismissing discrimination allegations without investigation." Dr. Brooks nodded grimly. "Agent Chen, those documents will demonstrate that today's incident wasn't isolated misconduct. It was the predictable result of company policies that encouraged and protected discriminatory behavior." Tommy's live stream captured their conversation as they walked, providing real-time documentation of how federal civil rights investigations operated. Behind them, Rachel Coleman was being escorted by federal marshals, her once authoritative uniform now a symbol of fallen prejudice. Her 22 years of airline service had ended with federal charges that would likely result in prison time and lifetime prohibition from aviation employment. Katie Walsh walked alongside other Skystream employees, all of whom were facing unemployment, but also potential testimony opportunities in what was shaping up to be the most significant aviation civil rights case in history. "Katie," Dr. Brooks said, pausing in her progress through the terminal, "I want you to know that federal law protects employees who report discrimination. Your courage today will be rewarded, not punished." "Dr. Brooks, what's going to happen to all the innocent Skystream employees? People who never discriminated against anyone but just happened to work for a company with bad policies." It was a compassionate question that demonstrated Katie's character, even in the midst of personal uncertainty. "Katie, the Department of Labor has programs specifically designed to help employees when their companies face federal shutdown for civil rights violations. More importantly, airlines with proper diversity training and anti-discrimination policies will be competing to hire crew members like you, people who have proven they'll stand up for what's right." The conversation was being heard by thousands of aviation professionals worldwide, many of whom were beginning to understand that civil rights compliance was no longer optional in their industry. As they reached the main terminal area, the scope of media coverage became apparent. Every major news network had crews on scene. International outlets were providing live coverage. Aviation trade publications were documenting what they called the day everything changed. CNN's chief aviation correspondent approached Dr. Brooks with cameras rolling. "Dr. Brooks, you've just grounded an entire airline for civil rights violations while the incident was being live-streamed to 100,000 people worldwide. What message does this send to the aviation industry?" Jasmine looked directly into the camera, knowing her words would be analyzed by airline executives, civil rights advocates, and federal prosecutors around the world. "The message is simple. The era of treating discrimination as a minor customer service issue is over. The Federal Aviation Administration has the authority to ground airlines, prosecute executives, and seize corporate assets when civil rights violations occur. We will use that authority. What changes can passengers expect to see going forward? Passengers can expect comprehensive federal oversight of airline diversity training, standardized civil rights compliance protocols, and meaningful consequences when discrimination occurs. Most importantly, they can expect that speaking up about discriminatory treatment will be protected and supported by federal law. The interview was being broadcast live across multiple networks, ensuring that her message reached airline boardrooms worldwide. Meanwhile, the broader implications of the Skystream grounding were rippling through the aviation industry. Other airlines were convening emergency board meetings to review their own anti-discrimination policies. Flight attendant unions were demanding immediate civil rights training updates. Airline stocks across the sector were declining as investors realized that federal civil rights enforcement represented a new category of business risk. Agent Chen received another priority communication and approached Dr. Brooks with information that would expand the investigation even further. Dr. Brooks, our financial investigators have uncovered evidence that Skystream's discriminatory practices may have been part of a broader pattern of targeting minority passengers for additional fees, service restrictions, and complaint dismissals. Are you talking about biased financial discrimination based on race? That appears to be exactly what we're talking about. Minority passengers were statistically more likely to be charged baggage fees, denied upgrade requests, and have complaints dismissed without investigation. Dr. Brooks felt the familiar anger that came with discovering institutional racism disguised as business practices. Agent Chen, if that's accurate, we're not just talking about individual discrimination incidents. We're talking about federal conspiracy charges against corporate executives who designed and implemented racially biased policies. The implications were staggering. What had started as an undercover audit of customer service complaints was revealing biased corporate discrimination that could result in criminal prosecution of airline executives. Tommy Martinez, still documenting everything for his massive online audience, captured the moment when the investigation expanded from individual misconduct to corporate conspiracy. Y'all, are you hearing this? They're finding evidence that this airline was targeting minority passengers as a matter of corporate policy. This is about to get even bigger. Dr. Brooks addressed the growing crowd of media and passengers who had gathered to witness the historic federal investigation. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed on Flight 447 today was not an isolated incident. Our investigation has revealed that bias discrimination in aviation is more widespread than most people realize. But today marks the beginning of the end for airlines that think they can violate civil rights without consequences. She paused, looking around at the faces that represented the entire spectrum of American air travel. Federal law guarantees equal treatment regardless of race, ethnicity, or economic status. Airlines that fail to honor those guarantees will face federal consequences that can include grounding, prosecution, and seizure of assets. The choice is simple: comply with civil rights law or lose the privilege of serving the flying public. As federal agents began escorting key witnesses to official interview facilities, everyone present understood that they had witnessed the beginning of a new era in aviation civil rights enforcement. The woman who had been profiled and harassed for sitting in first class while black had not only exposed individual prejudice, she had triggered federal action that would reshape how airlines treat all passengers. And it had all been documented live for the world to see. As the immediate chaos of federal investigations and media coverage began to settle, Dr. Jasmine Brooks found herself in a quiet corner of Denver International Airport, surrounded by the people who had shown extraordinary courage during an ordinary flight that became anything but ordinary. Tommy Martinez finally ended his historic live stream after nearly 6 hours of continuous coverage, but not before addressing his audience one final time. Y'all, we just witnessed something that will be remembered forever. We saw what happens when ordinary people refuse to let injustice happen in silence. We saw a federal inspector deliver justice in the most public way possible. And we saw an entire industry change because people found the courage to do what's right. He looked around at the passengers from Flight 447, many of whom had become friends during their shared experience. Remember this day. Remember that your voice matters. Remember that speaking up changes everything. And remember that justice, when it finally comes, is something beautiful to witness. Katie Walsh approached Dr. Brooks with tears in her eyes, carrying the weight of having made the most important decision of her young career. Dr. Brooks, I need you to know something. 3 weeks ago when I started this job, I was just trying to serve drinks and make passengers comfortable. I never imagined I'd have to choose between my job and my conscience. Jasmine smiled warmly. Katie, you made that choice in the most public way possible in front of nearly 100,000 people worldwide. You chose conscience over comfort, justice over job security. That's the kind of character that changes the world. But what if I had stayed silent? What if I had just followed Rachel's lead and let it happen? Then an innocent passenger would have been humiliated without anyone speaking up for her. Discrimination would have won, and nothing would have changed for future passengers who might face the same treatment. Katie nodded, understanding that her moment of courage had rippled far beyond Flight 447. Dr. Brooks, will you stay in touch? I'd like to know how the investigation develops. Katie, I have a feeling we'll be working together again. The aviation industry needs people like you in leadership positions. People who understand that treating passengers with dignity isn't just good customer service, it's basic human decency. Maria Santos, the off-duty air marshal who had provided crucial testimony, joined the conversation. Dr. Brooks, in 15 years of federal law enforcement, I've never seen anything like what happened today. The combination of real-time documentation, multiple witnesses, and immediate federal response created something unprecedented. Marshal Santos, what made today different was that discrimination couldn't hide behind closed doors or he said, she said disputes. Everything was captured in real time by multiple sources and witnessed by thousands of people. Discrimination usually thrives in darkness and silence. Today it was exposed to the light. What changes do you expect to see in the aviation industry? Comprehensive civil rights training will become mandatory, not optional. Airlines will face regular federal audits of their discrimination prevention programs. Most importantly, passengers will know that speaking up about discriminatory treatment will be protected and supported by federal law. Captain Rodriguez approached the group, his face showing the weight of watching his airline collapse around him. Dr. Brooks, I need to ask for your forgiveness. As captain, I should have protected you from discrimination immediately and decisively. My hesitation enabled Ms. Coleman's behavior to continue and escalate. Jasmine looked at him with understanding rather than anger. Captain Rodriguez, your response today reflects training and cultural failures that went far beyond your individual judgment. You're a good pilot and a decent person who was failed by a system that didn't properly prepare you to handle discrimination when you witnessed it. What should I have done differently? You should have immediately removed Ms. Coleman from duty the moment she began harassing a passenger without cause. You should have documented her behavior officially rather than hoping it would resolve itself. And you should have understood that protecting passengers from discrimination is just as important as protecting them from mechanical failures. Rodriguez nodded grimly. You're right. I treated discrimination like a customer service issue instead of a safety issue. Discrimination is a safety issue, Captain. When crew members waste time harassing innocent passengers instead of focusing on actual security threats, when they file false reports that compromise communication and trust, when they create hostile environments that distract from operational safety, discrimination becomes a direct threat to aviation security. Mr. Davidson, the businessman who had initially supported Rachel's security diligence before recognizing it as obvious discrimination, joined the conversation with obvious remorse. Dr. Brooks, I owe you an apology. When this started, I thought Ms. Coleman was just being thorough with security. It took me far too long to recognize what was really happening. Mr. Davidson, your evolution during this flight represents something important. You started with assumptions based on your own experience, but you changed your mind when presented with evidence. That willingness to reconsider initial judgments is exactly what creates real change. How can someone like me do better in the future? Listen to the experiences of people who face discrimination regularly. When multiple passengers are telling you that someone is being treated unfairly, believe them. And understand that discrimination often disguises itself as reasonable policies or security procedures. As the group prepared to disperse, each returning to lives that had been fundamentally changed by their shared experience, Dr. Brooks addressed them all with a message that captured the broader significance of what they had accomplished. I want each of you to understand that what happened today extends far beyond one discriminatory flight attendant or one failed airline. You demonstrated something that gives me hope for our entire society. She looked around at faces that represented different backgrounds, ages, and perspectives, united by their shared commitment to justice. You showed that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to let injustice happen in silence. Katie risked her job to defend a stranger. Tommy documented everything to ensure accountability. Maria provided professional testimony that couldn't be dismissed. Captain Rodriguez ultimately chose passengers over problematic policies. Mr. Davidson changed his mind when presented with evidence. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 20 years fighting discrimination in federal service. Each of you had the option to stay silent, to mind your own business, to let someone else deal with the problem. Instead, you chose to speak up. You chose to act. You chose to ensure that dignity and respect weren't negotiable even at 30,000 feet. Tommy wiped away tears, still processing the magnitude of what they had all witnessed and participated in. Dr. Brooks, what happens now? How do we make sure this day actually changes things instead of just becoming another viral video that people forget about? Tommy, change happens when individual courage becomes collective action. Today, you documented discrimination being exposed and held accountable in real time. That documentation will be used in courtrooms, boardrooms, and classrooms to ensure this kind of treatment doesn't happen to other passengers. She gestured toward the bustling airport around them, where thousands of travelers continued their journeys, many now aware that federal law protected their right to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. But the real change happens when each of you takes the courage you showed today and applies it to every situation where you witness injustice. When you speak up at work, in your communities, wherever discrimination tries to hide behind policy or procedure. Katie Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Brooks, will we see each other again? Jasmine smiled with genuine warmth. Katie, I have a feeling our paths will cross again. The aviation industry is going to need leaders who understand that treating people with dignity isn't just good customer service, it's the foundation of everything else we do. As the group exchanged contact information and prepared to continue their separate journeys, everyone understood that they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had witnessed the moment when biased discrimination met federal accountability, when individual prejudice encountered institutional consequences, and when ordinary people found the extraordinary courage to ensure that justice was served. Dr. Jasmine Brooks walked toward the exit of Denver International Airport, no longer disguised as a nervous librarian, but revealed as the federal inspector who had just changed aviation history. Behind her, she left an airline in ruins, a federal investigation that would reshape an entire industry, and a group of ordinary people who had discovered their own power to create change. The discrimination that had started with 8 words, "Ma'am, you need to get out of that seat," had ended with institutional reform, federal accountability, and a new understanding that dignity at 30,000 feet wasn't just a courtesy. It was a federally protected right. And 100,000 people around the world had watched it happen live. 6 months later, the aviation industry had transformed in ways that seemed impossible before Flight 447. Skystream Airlines never flew again, its assets liquidated to compensate victims of documented discrimination and fund federal civil rights training programs. Rachel Coleman received a 3-year federal prison sentence for civil rights violations and obstruction of justice, becoming the first flight attendant in history to face federal prison time for passenger discrimination. Her case became required study material in aviation law courses nationwide, ensuring that future airline employees understood the consequences of bias-based decision-making. Katie Walsh became the youngest director of passenger advocacy at United Airlines, leading the industry's most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program. Her courage in speaking up during Flight 447 made her a symbol of moral leadership in aviation, and airlines across the country began recruiting employees specifically for their willingness to prioritize passenger dignity over crew hierarchy. Captain Rodriguez was hired by Delta Airlines as Chief of Civil Rights Compliance, using his experience from Flight 447 to help other pilots understand that protecting passengers from discrimination was as crucial as protecting them from mechanical failures. Dr. Jasmine Brooks received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her groundbreaking work in aviation civil rights, but she remained focused on the institutional changes her investigation had triggered. The Flight 447 protocol became federal law, requiring airlines to document and investigate all discrimination complaints within 48 hours, with federal oversight and consequences for failures. Tommy Martinez's live-stream documentation became the centerpiece of a new federal requirement that all passenger discrimination incidents be recorded and reviewed by independent civil rights monitors, ensuring that future incidents couldn't be hidden or dismissed. Today, when passengers board flights across America, they do so knowing that their dignity is federally protected by laws that emerged directly from the courage shown on Flight 447. The woman who was told she didn't belong in first class didn't just reclaim her seat. She redefined what equality means in American aviation. Her legacy isn't measured in airlines shut down or careers ended, but in the millions of passengers who now fly with the confidence that their humanity will be respected regardless of their appearance, background, or the assumptions others might make about who belongs where. If this story moved you, I want you to do something right now. Hit that like button if you believe dignity should be standard at every altitude. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to sharing stories where justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that speaking up changes everything, that one person's courage can transform entire industries, and that respect isn't earned by the price of your ticket, it's guaranteed by your humanity. Drop a comment and tell us about a time when you witnessed discrimination and chose to speak up, or when you wish you had found the courage to act. Your stories matter. Your voice matters. And together we can ensure that what happened on Flight 447 wasn't just a moment of justice, but the beginning of lasting change. Remember, justice isn't just about the destination. It's about how we treat each other on the journey. Until next time, keep flying with dignity, keep standing up for what's right, and never forget that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to let injustice happen in silence. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story, where courage meets consequence, and truth always finds its way to light.
Да.
Куда он сел? Вот куда он сел?
Так уж и быть, чувак, садись.
М5.
Привет, братиш. Вот мы и встретились.
Нахуй ты сказал, как будто, бля, выебал меня без 15. 5.
15,8.
5-5-8.
Без 15,8. Ебать, Рошана не бросим.
Сура. На мои ключи, блядь. Надо машину мне продать, я посчитал, у меня 11 машин.
Автосалон можно открывать, да, друг?
Да, надо продавать все, мне, блядь, деньги нужны. Веста хорошо зашла мне.
Деньги есть?
Есть. Еда в багажнике. Ну что я сделаю? Ну куда я сейчас выкину эту еду? Вот вы хорошо, вот куда я выкину?
Собаки как.
Ну куда я выкину? На улицу, блядь? Нет, конечно. И что? Что вы вот? Ну что ты, блядь? Что ты хочешь, Ара? Чекни ТГ Альфа. Мне плохо от них уже. Они меня надоели. Они, блядь, как, блядь, у меня как будто дети свои, блядь, есть, понял?
Цели кучей, блядь.
Клянусь! Хорошо, Альф. Глобал, захожу. Армянский язык на стриме Равшан с Равшаном. Подборка реакций. Блядь, это же мой сам стрим, я же его стримил.
Да ты чё, братан? Клянись сейчас.
Но я лайк поставлю. Мои дети, едем мы вот. Ты потихоньку едешь, чтобы целая куча была у тебя?
Угу.
Далеко ехать?
Не, за Галицким.
Блядь, ой.
Это от нас, да?
Да. Что делает? Бля, брат, какая же она охуенная. Клянусь. Это вот я не сидел в Живее Е60. Знаешь? Признаюсь тебе честно.
Да?
Да. В Живее не сидел я. По салону именно, вот минимум, как минимум. Салон очень, очень сильный. Да не решили, вот едем варить. Что это значит жить без тебя? Раш, а как тебе сиденья навесить? Удобные. Брат,
А здесь
после
как
гранты, я тебе говорю, я как будто в иномарку сел какую-то. Гранта такая, помню, спартанская машина. Такая она. Она...
Да ты чего?
Литы выиграли. Вау, 3-е место выиграли мы на пике. Литы 3-е.
Никогда ты не
Я снюс забил,
узнаешь,
Что это значит? Шман, тоже полный бак греет тебе. Новая машина, забыл.
Шма.
Шма.
Шема.
Шема, полный бак.
Шема.
Шема. Ебать, сигнал.
Такой дорогой, знаешь, богатый сигнал. Нейро. А мой был что-то, брат. А, это то, что ты не выложил, друг.
СТС. Бля, смотри, я уже хочу Алькантара потолок на гранте. Навесить, точнее.
Чем мы сегодня на нее? Хочешь сказать?
А я уже всю свиту договорился почти. Я у Виту буду делать. Алькантара потолок. Шум капери. Че еще такого засунуть? Что надо засунуть? Бля, пацаны, подсказка будет какая-то, блядь? Экстравагантное что-то. Посадка. Прошивка.
Ламбу двери.
Бля, да. А, 360 камеру лучше поставить, наверное. Есть.
Блядь, буду, скажи.
Бля, буду.
А там получится?
А то, что у меня в Ниве стоит, тебе вообще никак это не...
Нива, хуйня, шма.
За что?
Просто любя. Я завидую. Бля, шма, я не помню, дизель наверх. Наверх.
Доводчики? Да какие доводчики? А, двойные стекла.
Пати комфорт, братан.
Да, она очень классная. Несмотря на то, что я в ковшах сижу. Ковши, кстати, вот, что завидовали. Очень редкие. А, шма, они говорят, кого поставить турбо, автомат. Да, это я делаю. Я еще лям надо положить эту весту, я буду. Скок, шумка, музыка. Ладно, музыку греют, нам хорошо, уже не лям. Какой? Не, выхлоп я не буду менять. Я, наверное, паук только поменяю. Брат, банки у меня, брат, вы просто не шарите, понял? Спортовский выхлоп.
Здесь супер спринт банки, оказывается, все равно.
Да? Тоже интернет салам кидает, да? О, поймал. Или нет? Да, поймал. Здорово, пацаны, я здесь. Это я на швар узнали? Здорово, пацаны, это я на швар.
Шмаль, здесь вообще связи не было.
А я хуй его знает. Привезли чиниться малышку. Пацаны, извините, пожалуйста, за интернет, но я ничего не могу сделать, реально. Максимум все ж делаю, чтобы работало, блядь, просто ужас. Там штонер в круг. На бункер, блядь. О, что-то поймала.
Есть интернет?
Очень плохо.